Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us for this NARC Fiscal Year 2020 Appropriations Update. We are happy to have you, and it is a confusing time for appropriations, but we will try to do our best to talk you through where we are in the process so far. So just a quick general update before we get started. As of now, the House has passed 10 of the 12 federal appropriations bills through the chamber. So all that's left for them to consider for a floor vote is Homeland Security and the legislative branch general government. And as far as the Senate, they have been a little bit slower in this process. Whenever September started, they hadn't passed any of their appropriations bills, even through committee. So they were waiting primarily for the two-year budget deal to happen and be hammered out. Now that that's done, they're quickly trying to go through the process of approving their bills through committee and hopefully bring them to the floor pretty soon. So that's where we're at. The Senate has passed the Defense and the Energy and Water bill out of the full committee so far, and the latest news is that we're waiting for 3 more bills to be passed through the full committee, the full Senate Appropriations Committee, which is Agriculture and Rural Development, Financial Services and General Government, and Transportation and Housing and Urban Development. So with that, we're going to kick it off first by sort of giving you the breakdowns of appropriations bills, sort of what we're seeing in terms of funding so far for programs that matter most to regions. And then we'll, after that, we'll go to sort of the latest that's been going on with any potential continuing resolutions to help stop in the case that the appropriations bills aren't done on time. To make sure that the federal government stays open, and sort of what NARC sees happening in the next few weeks related to appropriations. And then finally, we'll touch on a few advocacy considerations for you all before jumping over to question and answers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric for the first part of our appropriations breakdown, covering transportation and housing and urban development. Eric?
Great, thanks so much, Macy. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody that is on the call today, and happy to walk through some of what we are seeing. I'm going to focus primarily on the transportation portion of the transportation appropriations bill, which also, of course, includes some HUD provisions as well, some housing provisions that Macy's going to cover a little bit later. So in the current status of this bill, the Senate yesterday approved a bill out of subcommittee, and so the information I can provide to you today is basically hot off the presses. And then this should go before there's a full committee markup scheduled tomorrow. And if you are so inclined and want to join in the fun, it's at 10:30 in the morning Eastern time. You can go on the Senate Appropriations website and find a link to the hearing there. The House passed its version of THUD as part of a consolidated package back in mid-June. And so at this point, we are at least moving toward a more complete picture of what each chamber is looking to do with its versions of this bill. As regards USDOT, of course, much of the funding that's contained in this bill has already been spent by the FAST Act authorization bill. And so in some sense, we're talking about the portions that are beyond FAST Act. Both bills, for the most part, fully fund the FAST Act. There are a couple of provisions, I think, that are not fully funded, a couple of rail provisions, but I think for the most part, it does fully fund the provisions that are in FAST. One area of interest is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program grants that the last couple of bills have contained that go above and beyond the amounts provided in the FAST Act directly to STBG. The last couple of years, those have been fairly robust. Last year's total was $2.7 billion was provided for this purpose. And this year we see a pretty dramatic reduction of that, though still an amount above the FAST Act amount. So the Senate bill has a $1.25 billion supplemental for STBG. The House has $1.5 billion, so both well short of the $2.7 billion we saw last year. With regard to the capital investment grants, the New Starts program, the Senate bill provides $2 billion for New Starts. The House has a higher amount at $2.3 billion. Both of them basically fund all of the currently approved full funding grant agreement projects, and also I think all projects that are also meet all the criteria under the program. The House provides some additional funding that goes above that for some small starts projects and some other things. But there's about a $300 million difference between the two of them. Under the transit formula grants, which funds things like state of good repair, bus grants, no-low emission grants, the Senate has last year's amount for those items was $700 million. The House would increase that to $750 million, where the Senate would cut it fairly dramatically, 20% cut down to $560 million. So obviously quite a difference in some of the provisions there. In regards to the rail title, or the rail portion of the appropriations bill, Amtrak receives about $2 billion in each bill, so that is a pretty settled amount. Also, there are the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement, or CRISI grants. Last year received $255 million. The Senate provided that amount. This year, the House increased it by, up to $350 million. So again, a fairly significant difference between those two. Also, the Federal State Partnership for State of Good Repair Grants, another rail grant program. Senate provides $300 million for that, where the House has $350 million. The Build Grant program has each bill provides $1 billion, which would be a $100 million increase over last year. So we should see some growth in the Build Grants program this year. And then the House bill has a provision for highly automated system safety center of excellence. Does not exactly roll off the tongue, which has $10 million in the House bill. I did not find it in the Senate bill. I may have missed it, but this is a new program. It's not a lot of money, obviously, but I think it is interesting that they, again, Congress attempting to figure out some ways to get some money going into automated vehicle research and advancing emerging technologies and the like. I also wanted to make a couple of notes about the CR, the continuing resolution. I know Macy's going to address the CR in general a little bit later, but a couple of items of note related to transportation in regards to the CR. The FAST Act, as I'm sure folks are aware, contains a rescission, a $7.6 billion rescission of contract authority. And basically all that was to do is to make the bill look smaller when it passed, so that they needed less offset in order to pass the bill 3 years ago. And so essentially, though the sub-allocated portion of STBG is not impacted by this per existing law, there is still going to be quite a bit of pressure on the program if this rescission goes through, because essentially this will wipe out almost all of the contract authority that exists at the state level for projects. And so that the $7.6 billion rescission essentially matches the available contract authority. So this is a fairly significant problem, and one that there is quite a push to try and reverse. As Jeff Davis in Transportation Weekly has pointed out, the appropriations bill is probably not the best vehicle for it anyway. The CR is probably not the best vehicle for it, which is the reason that the Senate EPW committee introduced a standalone bill that would also reverse the rescission. And part of the challenge is that if we get into next year with the rescission, the amount of that rescission gets baked into the baseline of the overall program, and so makes reauthorization that much more expensive from an offset standpoint going forward. So this actually is a fairly important topic, and one that we hope they can find a solution to between now and the end of this fiscal year, so as to avoid some of the problems that would arise if this carries over into next fiscal year. And I'll also point out that in the past, some of these rescissions have actually been allowed to stand, and the contract authority has actually been rescinded. And so that would be kind of a worst case scenario. there. So hopefully they will find a solution to this, though they have not as yet figured out how to deal with this. And then one other item from the CR. So I'm referring to the draft CR that has been released does not contain the rescission. That doesn't mean it can't be added, but it seems unlikely at this point. So the draft CR does, however, delay across the board cuts in mass transit apportionments for 2020. There's the so-called Rostenkowski test, which is, I won't go into the details of, but basically as the transit account gets low enough, there has to be offsetting reductions in spending in future fiscal years in order to make up that gap. And so basically what the CRS does is it says no Rostenkowski test for now until as long as the CR is in force. And as well, the House has a 1-year moratorium on that rule on the test. So in essence, we should see some relief from any cuts in mass transit spending until they're able to get a reauthorization done, which then therefore should resupply the Highway Trust Fund with enough resources to prevent any problems like that in the future, or at least in the near term. So that is all I have for now, and I will pass it off, I believe, to Neil for the next portion.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for joining the call. Excuse me. I'm going to spend a few minutes speaking about appropriations for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. To begin, I think it's worthwhile to just provide you with a big picture. So the President's proposal, budget proposal, for each department would have reduced funding in fiscal year 2020 from current levels to anywhere from 11% for the Departments of Labor and Education and 14% for the Departments of Health and Human Services. Now, the House proposal, which has been adopted by the House, for each department would increase funding in fiscal year 2020 from current levels by anywhere from 2% for the Department of Labor to about 1 to 1.5% for the Departments of Health and Human Services and Education. Not significant increases, but at least going in the right direction. The Senate proposal at this point is unclear since negotiations between Republicans and Democrats broke down largely over the Trump administration's Title X rule, which would block funds from providers that provide information about abortions. And what the Democrats wanted was for the rule to be basically eliminated, and ongoing disagreement over funding for the southern border wall. So back to the House proposal now and to some of the specifics. The proposed increases, as I said, are not significant. Often, program by program, they are less than inflation. However, these proposed increases do represent the House's effort to maintain current funding or increase current funding for most domestic programs. The programs within the Department of Education that would benefit most from these small increases are early childhood development, public education, with the largest increases going to the IDEA, Title I programs, and Pell Grants, something that many of you may be familiar with if you're running your local workforce development program. Among the Department of Health and Human Services program, the biggest increases would go to NIH research, public health, and for the first time in 20 years, funds for the CDC and NIH to research gun violence. Among the Department of Labor programs receiving increases, the biggest would go to workforce development programs. If the House proposal is adopted, employment and training programs would receive 11% more than in fiscal year 2019. Unfortunately, only about half of that increase would go to local job training programs. The rest would go to special programs and the Dislocated Worker National Reserve Program, which those of you who operate your job training programs know that is a program the Secretary of Labor awards to workforce development areas based on grant proposals. Before concluding, I did want to give you an idea of funding increases for specific programs important to regions. And I'm not going to give you dollar amounts, I'm just going to give you percentages. I'm always happy to provide those dollar amounts if you want them. The community service employment for older Americans would actually receive a very significant increase, 15%. Low-income home energy assistance would receive a 5% increase. Aging and disability services under the Administration for Community Living, and this is primarily for area agencies on aging, would receive an 8% increase. Of course, none of this is written in stone, and much will depend on what the Senate decides to do. But if I were a betting person, I would say that we are likely ultimately to see something resembling the House proposals as we move forward with the appropriations process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Macy to talk about community and economic development and public safety.
All right, thanks, Neil. So I'll just go through this really quickly, sort of looking over the big departments and agencies, and then sort of drilling down a little bit to particular programs of interest. The housing and urban development top line looks healthy. I think for both the House and Senate, it was a little bit more than last year what was given, so that's great news. The Economic Development Administration, we've only seen what's happened in the House so far, but based on that, it's really great news. They almost doubled the amount that was given to EDA last year. So hopefully they're recognizing, the role that EDA plays in disaster recovery and resilience. So that's good news for especially our folks that are, economic development districts. Looking at the 2020 census, there was a big bump for the Census Bureau, which a lot of that funding will go, of course, to running the 2020 census this year. I think they almost doubled the amount that they provided to the Census Bureau than they did last year, which makes sense because they're ramping up for, of course, the 2020 census next year. So that's good news, and I think that makes a lot of census advocates like us happy. For the Federal Emergency Management Agency, well known as FEMA, there was a slight bump for the funding that the House provided as opposed to last year. We don't know what the Senate will do yet, but that's positive news. For the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically their rural development portion, the House gave significant increase in funding. The Senate gave a smaller increase, but either way, it sort of shows, how much additional funds that are going into rural development to help with different facets of rural America. There's a lot of money that was given to rural broadband and water and waste programs, both the loans and the grants. So that's a positive note as well. And then drilling down a little bit into the block grants, I think Eric may have mentioned it earlier, the Community Development Block Grant is looking good. The House gave it a bump. The Senate kept it at level funding, so hopefully we'll be going with the House number this year. The Home Investment Partnerships Program, the House gave that a good bump in funding as well. I think the Senate leveled off on the funding, so hopefully it'll be the same story with CDBG. And then the Social Services Block Grant, stayed the same in both the House and the Senate, so I imagine it'll just remain level funding this year. And then the Community Services Block Grant, at least for the House side, it got a small bump in funding. Let's see. And looking at flooding, which I know a lot of our members are dealing with this year, at least for the House, we're able to sort of get some kind of insight into what funding will look like for that, particularly for the flood hazard mapping and risk analysis program. There was the funding had leveled out for this year as opposed to last year, and then the National Flood Insurance Fund, which helps support the National Flood Insurance Program, received only a slight bump. So with that, the opioids, of course, we know that's a big issue, and then of course a larger substance abuse crisis going on throughout the U.S. There's definitely money for opioids again this year, much like last year. The House gave or is willing to give the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at least $3.8 billion, which was an increase from last year. And then on the Senate side, there's an increase in funding for the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and helping provide new flexibility to states to use the funding to combat the increasing level of stimulant use, and just really trying to put more money into treatment and prevention efforts. So we can imagine that in the final bill there'll be quite an amount of money given to help alleviate localities and states from the hardships of what has been the last few years of the larger substance abuse crisis. So with that, I will go ahead and throw it over to Eli for our energy and environment section.
Thank you, Macy. All right, so I'm looking at energy and environment, which is two different bills, the Energy and Water Development and Related Agencies and Interior Environment and Related Agencies bills. And I'm going to start quickly with energy and water, and then hop over and spend a little bit more time on interior and environment. So energy and water funds a few different agencies. It's Department of Energy, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and some of the Department of the Interior programs, among a few other agencies. And we, at this point, actually have both a House bill and a Senate bill. The Senate bill is one of the few that made it through earlier. The House bill and Senate bill are largely similar bills. The House has $46 billion in overall funding, which is a couple billion above last year's enacted levels, and it's $8 billion above the president's budget request, which would have included really big cuts to the Army Corps of Engineers. They would have been cut by about 31%. DOE funding would have dropped by about 12%. Bureau of Reclamation out west would have also been cut by about a third. But the House bill and the Senate bill both don't include that. The Senate bill, which just came out, is a $48.9 billion bill, so it's a couple billion above the House bill, but that's just because it includes a pilot program for nuclear waste, which the House bill didn't include, but I don't think there's any indication that that should be a sticking point for the bills. And it got out of committee 31-0, so it was not particularly contentious in the Senate. It's just in large kind of a pushback against all those White House budget cuts that would have slashed Army Corps energy efficiency projects, renewable energy research. There were a lot of proposed cuts, and none of those made it in. So it's largely level funding with a few bumps here and there. And then to hop over to the Interior Environment Bill, that's covering Department of the Interior, and importantly, it's covering the Environmental Protection Agency and a slew of other smaller agencies. And that bill also made it through the House all the way back in May, and there is not yet a Senate bill. So just looking at the House bill, it's $37 billion in overall funding. that's a couple billion above last year's enacted levels. And again, it's just, I think, just under 8 billion under the president's proposed budget. So EPA gets about $9 billion of that 37, and that is split between EPA core budget money and state and tribal assistance grants. Looking at the core budget money, that includes geographic programs, which are things like Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and programs for Chesapeake Bay and Long Island Sound. The president's budget proposed pretty much just eliminating those, and so they have been funded this year, and they are funded mostly flat with, I think, a slight increase. And in addition to the geographic programs, the core budget money also includes a significant jump for funding for scientific and regulatory work on PFAS. So funding was doubled from last year for PFAS. And then looking at the state and tribal assistance grants, that again saw a moderate increase from last year, and it's significantly above what the president's budget would have given it. It's $3.1 billion for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, so that's $345 million over last year, and it's about $1 billion above the proposed budget from the president. $70 million is going for targeted grants for drinking water contaminants, that's lead, nitrates, and other health hazards. And Brownfields gets $105 million, which is a $20 million increase over last year, and it's 40% over what the president's budget had given it. And then lastly, Superfund gets $1.21 billion this year. That's a $50 million increase over last year, and again, a significant bump over the proposed White House budget. So that is the House bill. It's a lot of programs are flat with a few increases here and there. I think PFAS is a notable thing that popped up this year. And then looking at the Senate bill, that has not yet been released, but there is a markup scheduled for next week for the 24th at 9:30. So we will certainly be keeping an eye out for that. I'll pass it over to you, Macy.
All right, thanks, Eli. So we will touch just a little bit on the continuing resolution that the House has been sort of grappling with over the last week or so. The House was actually supposed to introduce it yesterday evening in the House rules with the intent to begin floor debate later this week. However, there were some issues that the House lawmakers had to work through, including those related to trade assistance for farmers hit by the regulatory tariffs going on, and details of several healthcare program extensions. And because of that, it sort of delayed the final text from being completed, and because it was incomplete, they just decided to pull it off of the agenda at the last minute last night. The Rules Chairman did say that it was possible that the bill could be brought up today, so be on the lookout for that. And I think that will all just really depend on whether these details that they're grappling with can be resolved over the next 24 hours since yesterday. So I know that Eric provided a few details on what that draft CR looks like based on a version that was released, I think it was late last week. But it would be expected to run through November 21st. So it'll give federal lawmakers about 6 working weeks to continue the appropriations process. So I think there were a few extensions that were going to be included in that as well. I know the National Flood Insurance Program was one of them. I think that particular program has been received short-term extensions 12 times since 2017, so it's a little disappointing to see that it'll be extended have a short extension again. But I just don't think that they'll work through all those issues before September 30th. Let's see. So then we'll skip on to what will happen next. And I'm happy to have any of the NARC staff jump in on this too, and maybe their crystal ball is a little clearer than mine. But we do know that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is planning to hold a procedural vote today on a package of 4 fiscal appropriations bills that have already passed in the House. So that's defense, labor, HHS, and education, the energy and water, and the state foreign operations bills. And we're seeing that this is likely going to cause conflict because we know, based on what Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has said, Democrats would not support moving forward with the defense bill until the Trump administration abandons their plans to divert $3.6 billion from military construction projects to help pay for a wall along the southern border. Meanwhile, McConnell has said that he wants to pass as many of the appropriations bills as possible by September 30th before clearing some kind of stopgap or continuing resolution bill to keep the government funded beyond September 30th. So they both know, we all know the time is ticking away, and we have, I think, 7 working days before September 30th. So these 2 Senate leaders especially will have to come together to negotiate and work out what's the best path forward. It seems like the news is changing every day on whether we will be able to clear at least some of the appropriations bills in the House and the Senate before the deadline approaches. So it's hard to know what is going to happen next, but we will certainly keep you all updated between eRegions and Transportation Thursdays on the latest news that's going on. So I would just say watch what's happening in the Senate, keep an eye on the continuing resolution that is being considered in the House, especially I think if they're able to introduce that again today, that we could see it come to a floor vote by the end of this week. So that'll be something that'd be looming and something certainly for the Senate to consider as they're trying to really gun through the rest of these appropriations bills. So with that, we are just going to throw it over really quickly to Neil for advocacy considerations, unless anybody else has anything to add on the what we expect to happen next section.
Well, I guess I'll jump in then, Macy, and talk a little bit about advocacy. I think it's important that in these last few weeks before some resolution to the appropriations process occurs, that if you can, to reach out to your senators in particular, to share with them any concerns you might have with the proposed appropriations. And I say senators because the House has done a significantly better job of passing their appropriations bills than the Senate has. So there's much less to deal with in the House. I should say that passing the appropriations bills has been, according to leadership, the #1 priority for the House and Senate. However, with the breakdown of negotiations, it seems less and less likely that Congress is going to be done with the appropriations process by September 30th, necessitating a continuing resolution, at least for some programs, if not for all. If you do reach out to your senators, you may want to do so in a few different ways. Obviously, you can phone their offices and share with the office your concerns. Sending letters is another effective way. Or you can have in-person visits. And assuming that the process is not completed by the end of the month, you will be able to take advantage of a 2-week recess that begins on September 27th and ends on October 4th, in large part because of the Jewish holidays. You can try to meet with your senators in their state offices. Speak to them directly about your concerns. That's usually the most effective way of reaching them. Barring that, either a phone call or a letter would be the best remaining options. I do want to say this too, because on occasion, we do get some concerns from some regions that are concerned that they really cannot lobby, and obviously their federal funds may restrict lobbying or advocacy of any sort. But it should be known that in general, nonprofits can use upwards of 20% of their funding for advocacy work without having to report that to the IRS or to designate themselves as an advocacy organization. The other thing that's probably easier and less problematic, less stressful, if you will, is to simply reach out to your members of Congress for educational reasons. Just let them know you want to share with them what you think is necessary to make programs operate effectively. I would caution against saying that you prefer any specific language in any legislation, but you should feel free to use the education approach as a way to at least get information to your members of Congress. Finally, if you need very specific appropriations information, such as proposed funding for a specific program, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us, and we will get you that information. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Macy to begin the question and answer period.
Great, thanks, Neil. So we will go through a Q&A real quick. If you would like to submit a question, please use the question at the bottom of your GoToWebinar application. But with that, I'll ask the first question. Can you please review the part of the presentation that Eric touched on regarding the $7.6 billion rescission in the FAST Act?
Sure. So this is Eric again. So the FAST Act reauthorization contains on its expiration date, so in the end of September next year, a rescission of $7.6 billion in contract authority. And so in essence, they're going to pull back pretty much the remaining contract authority that states will have at that point to spend on projects, to use for projects. And so we are working to try and reverse that rescission in concert with organizations. AASHTO is particularly concerned about this for obvious reasons, but trying to encourage Congress to find a way to do something, whether it be in a CR or in any other must-pass or standalone legislation, to reverse that rescission. And at the moment, as discussed, the draft CR that was released recently does not contain anything regarding the rescission. And so therefore, at this point, the rescission will continue to be in force, and we will have to continue to find ways to reverse it. Now, I will also note, just to add to what I said earlier, we would be able to contend with the rescission next year as well, to stop the rescission from occurring. But it does, as I mentioned, get more complicated from a budgeting standpoint, potentially, if the rescission goes into next year, which is why there's been an aggressive push this year to try and figure out a way to reverse that rescission in this fiscal year.
All right, thank you. Next is with regard to HUD. Do we know how the housing choice vouchers and public housing allocation turned out for this appropriation, up or down? I can provide the House funding level information, at least for the the housing choice vouchers, and I can try to see if I can hit some of the public housing, but certainly follow up with me, and I'm happy to provide more specific information for that. So I see here that there was $21.4 billion for housing choice voucher renewals, which is $1 billion above the enacted level last year, so that's positive news. We saw a 2% increase from last year on voucher administrative fees. And there's also in the House bill been provided $25 million for a voucher mobility demonstration, and up to $5 million of this 25 can be used for vouchers, and the rest would be for mobility related services, including pre and post move counseling and rent deposits to help families with children move to areas of opportunity. Just covering maybe a few of the other sort of housing related things under HUD. There was $2.8 billion for homeless assistant grants, which is an increase of about 6% from last year. And I believe that the Senate had a similar number, but I'm gonna have to go back and look at that for sure. But housing programs like Section 811 for persons with disabilities, and then Section 202 with housing for the elderly, both of those saw a very significant increase as well. So if there was a more specific program that you wanted me to look up for you, I'm happy to do it. Just send me a note or just call me, and all of our contact information is here on the webinar slide. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. With that, I don't see any other questions here, so maybe we'll just go ahead and wrap up. But again, thank you all so much for joining us and taking time out of your busy day to be a part of our appropriations update. And as the process goes forward, if you have any questions between now and September 30th, or even after the fact about the process or about specific programs, or just wanting to know where to find the House and the Senate bills, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to offer that assistance to you. But otherwise, I thank you all for joining and hope you have a great day. Thank you.